Welcome back to mildly interesting and sleepy. The night is doing its quiet thing around you, and that is exactly the right context for what we have tonight, because the poem we are going to follow is one that was written for quiet attention, for the kind of reading that happens when the day is over and you can give something your full, unhurried mind. Tonight, we are going into the Aeneid. The Aeneid is Virgil's great epic poem, written in Latin in the final decade of the 1st century before the Common Era, finished in the sense that we have it, but not finished in the sense Virgil intended, because he died before he could revise it to his satisfaction. And according to the story, he gave instructions on his deathbed that it should be burned. It was not burned. His friends and his emperor intervened, and the poem survived, and for 2,000 years it has been doing what great poems do, being read, being argued over, being translated and adapted and taught and mourned over and argued about again. It is the story of a Trojan hero named Aeneas who escapes the destruction of Troy and spends years wandering the Mediterranean, trying to reach Italy, where the gods have told him he will found the line that will eventually become Rome. It is, on its surface, an adventure story with monsters and gods and storms and wars and love. It is also, underneath all of that, one of the most serious and most melancholy poems ever written, a meditation on what it costs to build an empire, what is lost in the building, and whether the loss is worth the price. Virgil wrote it in the shadow of Augustus Caesar, in a Rome that had just survived generations of civil war and was learning what peace felt like after so much violence. He was writing a foundation myth for a civilization, and he was doing it with full awareness of everything a foundation myth has to leave out, everything a civilization buries under its monuments. The Aeneid is an official poem that contains within it a sustained private grief. That combination is part of what makes it inexhaustible. Let us begin with who Virgil was and what he was living through when he wrote it. Virgil and his world, Rome at the turning point. Publius Virgilius Maro, whom we call Virgil, was born in 70 before the Common Era near Mantua in northern Italy, in a region that was still becoming Roman in the sense of full civic integration. His father was a farmer of modest means, and Virgil grew up in the agricultural landscape of the Po Valley, which would stay with him his whole life. The Eclogues, his earliest major poems, are pastoral poems about shepherds and countryside, and even in the Aeneid there is a tenderness for the rural and the particular that goes back to childhood. He was educated in Cremona and Milan, and then went to Rome for the rigorous training in rhetoric and philosophy that the Roman elite required of ambitious young men. He was brilliant and shy and constitutionally unsuited to the public performance of rhetoric, which was the standard career path for a man of his education and talent. He turned to poetry instead. He spent years studying Greek literature with the depth and attention of a scholar, and the poems he eventually wrote are saturated with that knowledge. In conversation with Homer and Theocritus and Apollonius of Rhodes, and the whole tradition of Greek epic and pastoral poetry in ways that required an educated Roman reader to perceive and appreciate. The world he grew up in was a world in continuous political crisis. The Roman Republic, the system of government that had organized Rome for 5 centuries, was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The armies had become loyal to their generals rather than to the state, and the generals, Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus, and then Antony and Octavian, fought a series of civil wars that devastated Italy and the provinces and killed enormous numbers of people. Virgil was young during the civil wars, and he saw their cost directly. The Eclogues contain, within their pastoral beauty, a dark current of displacement and loss. Shepherds losing their lands, people driven from homes they had lived in for generations, the ordinary countryside disrupted by political violence that arrived from somewhere far away and did not care what it destroyed. In 31 before the Common Era, at the Battle of Actium, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra and became the sole ruler of the Roman world. He subsequently took the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, and established what historians call the Principate, the system of government that would eventually be called the Roman Empire. Augustus ruled as the first citizen, presenting himself not as a king or a tyrant, but as the restorer of the Republic, the man who had brought peace after a century of war. This presentation required a cultural program, a set of stories and symbols and poems that would explain Rome to itself, that would make sense of all the suffering and justify the outcome. Virgil, who was already recognized as the greatest living Latin poet, was the natural person to write the central poem of that program. He spent the last decade of his life, from roughly 29 to his death in 19 before the Common Era, writing the Aeneid. He worked slowly and with extraordinary care, composing sometimes only a few lines a day, leaving passages in draft form to be returned to, maintaining the poem in a state of controlled incompleteness that he intended to resolve in a final revision. He never got to make that revision. He died in Brundisium, modern Brindisi, returning from a trip to Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean at the age of 50. He had told his friends the Aeneid was unfinished and asked that it be destroyed. His literary executors, Varius Rufus and Plotius Tucker, published it instead, at Augustus's instruction or with his encouragement. The poem survives with a handful of half-lines and a few passages that Virgil would presumably have reworked, and these imperfections are, paradoxically, part of the poem's texture now, evidence of the labor that went into it. What came before? Troy, Homer, and the weight of tradition. To understand the Aeneid, you need to understand what Virgil was writing against and with, which is Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey, the two great Greek epics, were the founding texts of the entire literary tradition that Virgil inherited, the poems against which everything else in that tradition defined itself. Every educated Roman knew Homer. Virgil knew Homer the way a musician knows their instrument, intimately, completely, with the full awareness of what it could do and what it had done. The Aeneid is structured as a response to Homer. The first 6 books, the half that follows Aeneas on his sea voyage and his descent into the underworld, are the Odyssey half. Aeneas wandering, like Odysseus, trying to reach a destination the gods have ordained while being impeded by divine hostility and drawn aside by various temptations and disasters. The second 6 books, the half that follows the war in Italy, are the Iliad half. Aeneas fighting, like Achilles, in a brutal conflict that will cost lives on both sides and end with the death of a young warrior of exceptional quality. But the relationship to Homer is not imitation. It is transformation, in some cases inversion. Where Homer's Odyssey ends in homecoming, in restoration, in the hero returning to his proper place, Virgil's Aeneid is about the impossibility of homecoming. Troy is gone. Aeneas can never return there. The place he is going to is not a place he comes from, but a place he is building toward, a future he will never himself inhabit. Where Homer's Iliad ends with the grief of Achilles at the death of Patroclus, and the pity of Achilles for Priam coming to ransom his son's body, a moment of human recognition across the lines of war, Virgil's Aeneid ends with Aeneas killing Turnus in a rage, unable to find the pity that Achilles found, the epic resolution that Homer achieved denied to the Roman hero. This is not an accident or a failure. It is the poem's deepest meaning. Virgil was writing about the cost of civilization, about what it requires of the people who build it, and what it takes from them, and he was honest enough to show that cost even in the poem that was supposed to celebrate what they built. Aeneas himself comes from the Iliad, where he appears as a significant Trojan warrior, second in importance only to Hector among the defenders of Troy. He is a man under divine protection, with a destiny separate from the city's destruction. Poseidon rescues him from Achilles in the Iliad with the explicit statement that the race of Aeneas must survive, for he is destined to rule over the Trojans. Virgil takes this hint and builds an entire second epic around it, asking, what does it mean to be the man who survives when the city falls? What does survival cost, and what does it obligate? The opening, Arms and the Man. The Aeneid begins with one of the most famous lines in Latin literature, Arma verumque carno. I sing of arms and of a man. 4 words in Latin, 6 in English, and they announce the whole poem. Arms, war, the violence that is coming, the conflict that will define the second half of the epic. The man, not a god, not a hero in the Achillean mode of supernatural excellence, but a man, the word ver with all its Roman connotations of duty and endurance and pietas, the quality of faithful commitment to family and gods and city that Aeneas embodies, and that Rome prized above individual glory. The opening is a declaration of what kind of poem this will be, not the glory of a single hero, but the suffering and persistence of a man who carries a civilization on his back. The full opening invocation establishes what Aeneas is doing and why it is hard. He is fleeing from the shores of Troy, driven by fate, arriving eventually in Italy. He has been tossed about enormously on both land and sea by the power of heaven because of the wrath of cruel Juno, the queen of the gods. And he has suffered much in war too, before he could found his city and bring his gods to Latium. Hence the Latin race, and the Alban fathers, and the walls of high Rome. The invocation then asks the muse a question. What divine power was wounded? What grief drove the queen of the gods to push a man of such clear piety through so many toils? Can such anger dwell in heavenly minds? This question, can such anger dwell in heavenly minds, is one of the central questions of the poem, and it is asked without a definitive answer being given. The gods in the Aeneid are not consistently just or kind. Juno in particular is vindictive and relentless in a way that raises real questions about the relationship between divine will and human suffering. Virgil does not resolve these questions. He raises them and lets them stand. Juno's anger at Troy and at Aeneas specifically has several causes. She loves Carthage more than any other city, and she knows that one day Rome will destroy Carthage. She remembers the judgment of Paris, when the Trojan prince chose Aphrodite over Juno and Minerva in the beauty contest that started the whole sequence of events leading to the Trojan War. She remembers that she was on the Greek side in that war, and the Greeks won, but Aeneas survived and is now carrying Troy's survival forward. Her anger is cosmic and personal and ancient and entirely disproportionate to anything that can be done about it, and it is the engine that drives the plot. The storm and Carthage, a city of shadows. The Aeneid opens in the middle of Aeneas's voyage, just as the Odyssey opens in the middle of Odysseus's. Aeneas and his fleet are sailing from Sicily toward Italy when Juno, watching from heaven, goes to Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, and asks him to send a storm to wreck the Trojan fleet. She offers him a beautiful nymph as a bride. Aeolus agrees. The storm is catastrophic. Ships are scattered, men are lost. The fleet is nearly destroyed before Neptune, the god of the sea, notices what Juno has done without his permission and calms the waters. The survivors make it to the coast of North Africa, to the territory where Carthage is being built. Aeneas, looking down from a cliff at the dispersed remnants of his fleet, makes a speech to his men that has been discussed and debated ever since. He tells them to endure, that better times will come, that one day they will look back on even this and find it something to talk about with gladness. But the narrator tells us that as he says this, he conceals his grief in his face and keeps his pain deep inside. The words of comfort are real, and the private anguish is real. Both are true simultaneously. This is Aeneas, the man who performs the role that others need him to perform while carrying his grief privately in the depths alone. His mother Venus, disguised as a hunting maiden, appears and tells him where he is and who is building this city. Dido, she says, is the Queen of Carthage, a woman who fled from Tyre after her husband Sychaeus was murdered by her brother Pygmalion. She brought her people with her across the sea and is now building a new city in a new land. She is, in other words, another exile, another person building something from the ruins of what was lost, a parallel to Aeneas that the poem establishes with care. Aeneas and his companion Achates, wrapped in a cloud of invisibility that Venus provides, walk into Carthage and observe the city being built. Virgil's description of the construction of Carthage is one of the most celebrated passages in the poem. He compares the Carthaginians to bees. Some carry heavy stones for the walls, some mark off the forum with a plough, others choose the site of the harbour. Like bees in early summer, he says, working in the flowering meadows, training the young to their work, pressing the flowing honey. Aeneas looks at this industry and says, with something close to envy, "Oh, happy those whose walls already rise." He is looking at a civilization being built, and he has not yet built his. Then he sees, on the walls of a temple to Juno being constructed in Carthage, paintings depicting the Trojan War. He sees the battles, the deaths, the fall of Troy rendered in art. He weeps. He says to Achates, "Here too are tears for the things of this world, and human mortality touches the heart." The Latin phrase, sunt lacrimae rerum, tears of things, is one of the most famous phrases in Latin literature, and it has never been fully translated because rerum means things, the affairs of the world, the fact of what happens, and the sentence says that even here in Carthage, even strangers weep for Troy. Even the art of enemies acknowledges the grief of what is lost. Aeneas is moved not by self-pity, but by the recognition that suffering is universal, that the sorrows of the world are legible across its boundaries. Dido, the most fully realized character in the poem. Dido, Queen of Carthage, is introduced to us as a figure of extraordinary quality. Beautiful, yes, but more importantly capable, commanding, generous, just. She receives the shipwrecked Trojans with genuine hospitality, promising them help and resources and the freedom of her city. She is moved by their story. She is in many ways everything a ruler should be, and Virgil introduces her at her most admirable, giving judgment to her people, presiding over her city's construction, deciding disputes with fairness and intelligence. Then Venus, alarmed that Juno might use Dido against Aeneas, sends the god Cupid disguised as Aeneas's young son Ascanius to inflame Dido with love for Aeneas. This divine intervention is one of the morally troubling elements of the poem. Dido does not fall in love with Aeneas freely. Her love is manufactured by the gods for their own purposes, Cupid acting on Venus's instructions. When we later judge Dido's choices, when we later feel the tragedy of what happens to her, the divine manipulation must be held in mind. She is not simply a woman who loved too much. She is a woman whose love was weaponized by powers she could not see or resist. At the great feast Dido holds for the Trojans, Aeneas tells the story of the fall of Troy and his subsequent wanderings. This takes 2 full books of the poem, books 2 and 3, and it is told in Aeneas's own voice, in the first person, which gives it an intimate quality entirely different from the narrator's voice elsewhere. He describes the Trojan horse, the Greeks emerging at night, the city burning, the killing of King Priam, the desperate fighting, the loss of his wife Creusa in the chaos of the flight. He describes the years of wandering after Troy, the failed attempt to settle in Crete, the prophecies that kept redirecting them westward, the death of his father Anchises in Sicily. As he tells this story, Dido falls more deeply in love, and Aeneas, for a time, responds. They become lovers. The poem describes it in a scene of great compressed power. While a storm drives everyone inside, Aeneas and Dido take shelter in a cave, and Dido calls it a marriage, and lightning witnesses it, and the Furies cry out, and from that day forward begins the dissolution. Dido calls it a marriage. The poem does not entirely validate this interpretation. Aeneas, in his later self-defense, will say there was no marriage contract. These two perspectives cannot be fully reconciled, and the poem does not try to reconcile them. They live in Carthage together. The city's construction slows. Dido is absorbed in Aeneas. Rumor flies across the world. Eventually, Jupiter notices and sends Mercury down to remind Aeneas of his destiny. The message is sharp and somewhat harsh. He is wasting his time. What about Ascanius? Does he not owe his son a future? Why is he building Carthage and not Italy? Aeneas, struck immediately by the divine message, makes his decision. He must go. He begins secret preparations to leave. Dido finds out. The confrontation between them is one of the great dramatic scenes in ancient literature, and it is not resolved cleanly in Aeneas's favor. She accuses him of treachery, of planning to leave secretly, of the betrayal of someone who saved him when he was shipwrecked and gave him everything. She says, "If I had a child by you, some little Aeneas playing about my halls who might recall you to me by his face, I should not feel so utterly caught and abandoned." Aeneas defends himself. He did not choose this. Italy is not his of his own will. The gods demand it. He says, "Do not distress yourself or me with your laments. I seek Italy not of my own free will." Neither of them is entirely wrong. Dido's grief is real and her accusation of betrayal has force. He is leaving. He was leaving in secret. Whatever they had together is ending. Aeneas's position is real too. He genuinely believes he has no choice, that the gods have ordained his path, and that refusing to follow it would be a betrayal of everything he is responsible for, his son's future, his people's destiny, his dead father's hopes. But the poem does not spare him the cost of his choice. He is doing what duty requires, and it is destroying someone who loved him, and the poem holds both of these truths simultaneously without resolving the tension between them. After Aeneas leaves, Dido kills herself on a funeral pyre, cursing Aeneas and his descendants with her last breath, calling down eternal enmity between Carthage and Rome. The historical wars between Rome and Carthage, the Punic Wars that were among the most devastating conflicts the ancient world had yet seen, are thus mythologized as the consequence of a broken love affair. Virgil knew his readers knew this history. The founding suffering of Carthage and Rome was bound together from the beginning, in the cave where Dido called it a marriage, and the gods had other plans. The underworld, Aeneas visits the dead. Book 6 of the Aeneid is widely considered the greatest sustained passage in Latin poetry, and it has a claim to being the finest thing Virgil ever wrote. It describes Aeneas's descent into the underworld to speak with the ghost of his dead father Anchises, guided by the prophetic priestess the Sibyl of Cumae. The descent follows Aeneas through the geography of the Roman underworld with the comprehensive deliberateness of a guided tour. He passes through the regions of those who died before their time, infants, those condemned unjustly, suicides, those who died of love. He crosses the river Styx on Charon's boat, the crossing that requires the golden bough, the magical branch that grants passage to the living in the world of the dead. which Aeneas has obtained on Sibyl's instructions. He sees famous sinners in Tartarus, the region of punishment, and the Elysian fields, the region of the blessed. He finds Dido there in the region of those who died of love. He speaks to her. She will not look at him. She turns away to her husband Sychaeus, who was murdered before she even met Aeneas, who loves her still in death. Aeneas weeps and says that he did not want to leave her, that the gods compelled him, that he did not know the grief his departure would cause. She says nothing. She looks at the ground and then turns away to Sychaeus, her expression unchanged, as if Aeneas were not there. He has brought to her the explanation she deserved and came too late, and she will not receive it. This silence is one of the most devastating moments in the entire poem. He finds his father Anchises in the Elysian fields. The reunion with his father is moving in a way that the encounter with Dido is not. Anchises reaches for him, reaches out his arms 3 times, and 3 times the shade slips through them, like wind, like a fleeting dream. This is the same image as in the Odyssey when Odysseus cannot embrace his dead mother, and its repetition in Virgil is deliberate. The grief of being unable to hold the dead is universal, belongs to every story about the living descending to find those they have lost. Anchises shows Aeneas the pageant of the future. The souls waiting to be reborn pass in procession, and Anchises names them. Romulus, who will found Rome itself, the kings of Alba Longa, Brutus, who will drive out the kings and establish the Republic, the great generals and statesmen who will build Rome's power across centuries, Julius Caesar and Pompey, and the civil wars that Virgil's own generation has just survived, and finally, Augustus Caesar, who is himself compared to a god, whose reign is described in terms of a golden age. The famous speech that Anchises delivers in the underworld, culminating in the lines about Rome's mission, is one of the most quoted passages in Virgil. He tells Aeneas, "Others will beat out breathing bronze with more delicacy, will draw living faces from marble, will plead cases better and trace the motions of the sky with their measuring rod and tell the rising of the stars. But you, Roman, remember to rule the nations with your power, for these will be your arts, to impose the custom of peace, to spare the conquered and beat down the proud." This speech defines the Roman mission as Virgil understood it, or as he presents Augustus's Rome as understanding it. The arts Rome claims are not the arts of Greece, not sculpture or oratory or astronomy. Rome's arts are governance, law, the imposition of order. This is both a celebration of Roman power and a subtle diminishment. Rome is saying it cannot do what Greece did, cannot make the beautiful things, can only manage the world that others have adorned. Whether Virgil is genuinely celebrating this mission or gently deflating it, or doing both simultaneously, is a question readers have been arguing about ever since the poem was published. Italy, the second half and its war. Aeneas emerges from the underworld and sails north to the mouth of the Tiber. He has arrived in Latium, the region of Italy where his destiny lies. The king of the local people, Latinus, has been told by oracle that his daughter Lavinia must marry a foreigner, and he welcomes Aeneas with the hospitality of a man who recognizes fate working itself out. He offers Lavinia in marriage. A political alliance and a peaceful foundation seem possible. Then Juno intervenes again. She sends the Fury Alecto to drive Amata, the queen, mad with opposition to the Trojan marriage, and to sting the Latin warrior Turnus, who had been betrothed to Lavinia before the Trojans arrived, into furious hostility. Alecto stirs up war between the Latins and the Trojans with systematic efficiency, and the second half of the Aeneid is the war that results. The second half of the Aeneid is harder for modern readers than the first. The wandering and the love story have universal appeal. The Italian war can feel like an extended and bloody military narrative without the emotional clarity of the earlier books. But this response misses what Virgil is doing. He is showing war honestly, which means showing it as terrible, as wasteful, as productive of grief on both sides, as something that creates losers even among the winners. The war in Italy is not a glorious triumph. It is a necessary destruction, and the poem mourns it even as it narrates it. Aeneas, needing allies, sails up the Tiber to the settlement that will one day be Rome, a simple village on the hills above the river, led by an old king named Evander. Evander is a Greek, an Arcadian who came to Italy generations before. He shows Aeneas around the site of future Rome. Here will be the Forum, here the Capitoline Hill, here the great temples. The scene is one of Virgil's most affecting. The present-day Rome of Augustus, and the Forum, and the Pantheon seen through the eyes of people walking through a shepherd's village on a hillside. The future visible to the poem's audience and invisible to the characters. Evander's son, Pallas, joins Aeneas's forces as an ally. He is young and brave and beautiful, and we understand from the way he is introduced that he will not survive. Pallas and Turnus, youth and its cost. The war in Italy produces its most concentrated grief in the figure of Pallas, Evander's son, who is killed by Turnus in battle. Turnus strips the sword belt from Pallas's body and wears it as a trophy, which is a warrior's right, but also a warrior's arrogance, and it is the detail that will matter at the very end of the poem. Aeneas, when he hears of Pallas's death, is devastated. He has, in some sense, been responsible for the boy. Evander sent his son, with Aeneas trusting Aeneas to look after him. The responsibility of the old for the young, of the powerful for those who follow them, is one of the poem's recurring concerns. Aeneas carries the weight of everyone who depends on him, his son Ascanius, his people, and now Pallas, and the weight is sometimes too much even for a man of his steadiness. He goes into battle in a rage of grief, killing indiscriminately, a passage the poem presents with the candor of something it is both uncomfortable with and unwilling to hide. Turnus himself is one of the most interesting and sympathetic figures in the poem's second half, which is part of Virgil's deliberate complication of easy judgment. Turnus is the man on the wrong side of history. The fates have decreed that Aeneas will win, that the Trojan-Latin alliance will be established, that Rome will eventually rise from this soil. Turnus stands against all of that, fighting for his betrothed and his people and his own honor in the traditional mode of the heroic warrior. He is wrong in the sense that the poem's cosmological architecture has decreed he will lose. He is also brave and honest and committed, and he will die for it. There is a moment in the war where Turnus has Aeneas's people trapped inside their camp and sets fire to the fleet. The ships are transformed by divine intervention into sea nymphs and escape, which is one of the more startling supernatural events in the poem, and Turnus interprets it as a sign of divine favor. The gods have taken the Trojans' ships, he says, which means they cannot escape. He is wrong about this too. He consistently reads the signs incorrectly, sees what he wants to see, interprets the evidence in ways that confirm his own desired narrative. He is not stupid. He is operating in a world where the divine will is not transparent, where the message of events is genuinely ambiguous, and he reads the ambiguity the wrong way. Camilla and the women of the poem. Among the Italian allies who fight against Aeneas is a figure who stands somewhat apart from all the others. Camilla, the warrior maiden of the Volscian people. She is one of Virgil's most original creations, a woman who fights in battle with skill and ferocity, dedicated to the goddess Diana from childhood, a hunter and warrior who has never known the domestic life that the poem's world assumes for women. Her backstory, given in a long flashback, is genuinely moving. Her father Metabuse, fleeing enemies while carrying the infant Camilla, came to a river too wide to swim with a baby. He wrapped her to a spear, prayed to Diana that she would be the goddess's servant if the throw succeeded, and hurled her across the water. The infant flew through the air, the spear struck the far bank, and Camilla survived. She grew up in the woods with her father, raised on her mother's milk, and the milk of a wild mare, her childhood weapons the shepherd's sling and javelin. She is utterly her own creation, shaped by wild places rather than civilization. In battle, she is extraordinary, cutting through enemies with the efficiency and grace of someone for whom violence is simply her natural mode of engagement. But she is killed by a javelin thrown by a man who had been stalking her, waiting for a moment when she was distracted by the gleaming armor of an enemy soldier, a moment of covetousness or just aesthetic appreciation that opened a gap in her attention. Her death is quick and is mourned by Diana, who sends her nymph to recover the body. The poem gives her a dignity in death equal to any male warrior. The women of the Aeneid more broadly are a complex and important presence. Dido is the most central, but the poem's women constitute a kind of counter-narrative to the official story of Roman destiny. Juno is female, and her opposition to Aeneas's mission is the engine of the plot's suffering. Amata, the Latin queen, goes mad with grief at the loss of her daughter's preferred match, and eventually kills herself when she thinks Turnus has died. Andromache, Hector's widow, appears briefly in Book 3 in a scene of almost unbearable sadness. She is living in a miniature Troy she has constructed in her exile, a copy of the river Simois, a false city to replace the real one. She has survived the destruction that killed her husband by becoming the slave of the man who killed him. Creusa, Aeneas's wife, appears as a ghost in Book 2 to tell him that she is already dead, that he must go without her, that she absolves him of the responsibility of her fate. The women of the Aeneid are repeatedly left behind by the march of destiny, and the poem notices this and mourns it without being able to change it. Pietas, what Aeneas is and what he costs. Aeneas is described throughout the Aeneid with the epithet pious, faithful, duty-bound. It is the most important word attached to him. In Latin, pietas encompasses obligations to the gods, to the family, and to the community. It is a comprehensive faithfulness to everything larger than the individual self that the individual is embedded in and responsible for. Aeneas, above all else, is the man who does his duty. But Virgil is too honest a poet to make this simply heroic. Pietas in the Aeneid is also the source of everything Aeneas loses and everything he cannot have. He leaves Dido because duty requires it, and Dido dies. He fights a war he did not want because fate has ordained it, and people die, and Pallas dies. And in the end, Aeneas kills Turnus in a passion of grief rather than in calm justice, and we are not sure the killing is right. He carries on his back his old father Anchises, who dies in Sicily before they reach Italy and never sees the promised land. He carries forward his young son Ascanius, who is the reason for everything, the living justification for all the suffering, the line through whom Rome will descend. He never stops moving. He never stops losing. There is a famous image early in the poem when Aeneas is leaving Troy. He carries his father on his shoulders and holds his son by the hand, and they walk out through the burning city. The image has been painted hundreds of times in European art, Aeneas with Anchises on his back and Ascanius in his hand, the past on his shoulders and the future in his grasp. What the image usually leaves out, what the poem includes, is that his wife Creusa was following behind and in the chaos was lost. He did not notice until she was gone. He went back for her, into the burning city, risking everything, and found only her ghost, who told him she was already dead and told him to go. Pietas costs Aeneas his wife. It costs him his home. It costs him 7 years of wandering. It costs him Dido. It costs him his father. It will cost him Pallas. And at the end, it will cost him the clemency he might have shown Turnus, because when he sees the sword belt of Pallas on Turnus's shoulder, his grief overwhelms his magnanimity, and he kills him. Pietas, the poem argues, is real and necessary, and the foundation of everything worth building. And it is also terrible, and both of these things are true. The ending, what Virgil did and did not give us. The Aeneid ends with a single action. Aeneas kills Turnus. There is no aftermath, no founding of the city, no marriage to Lavinia, no portrait of the Roman civilization whose establishment has been the poem's stated purpose. The poem ends in a moment of violence, with Turnus's soul fleeing into the shadows, and then it stops. The ending has disturbed readers since antiquity, and the disturbance is probably intentional. Aeneas has been throughout the poem a figure of exceptional self-control, a man who sublimates his personal grief in service of his mission, who endures insults and losses without breaking. And at the very last moment, when Turnus is at his feet, wounded and asking for his life or his body to be returned to his father, Aeneas pauses. He is about to spare him. Then he sees the sword belt of Pallas, and something that has been controlled for the whole poem bursts out. He drives the sword in, saying, "Pallas kills you with this wound. Pallas exacts this penalty from your criminal blood." Is this the right action? The poem gives us the information to ask the question, but not the information to answer it cleanly. Turnus killed Pallas. He wore Pallas's sword belt as a trophy, which was traditional, but also an act of pride. He is at Aeneas's mercy. In the Iliad, which Virgil is consciously revising here, Achilles in his rage over Patroclus refused to spare Hector, and we understand his rage even as we see its excess. Virgil places Aeneas in exactly the same moment, and Aeneas makes the same choice. But where Achilles' rage in the Iliad is part of his heroic character, consistent with who he has always been, Aeneas's rage is a departure, a failure of the self-control that has been his defining quality. He has become, in the moment of his greatest victory, less than himself. Or he has become more than himself, in the sense of finally expressing a grief that Pietas had required him to suppress. There is no clean resolution. The poem ends in a question it has been building toward from the beginning, and Virgil's death before the final revision means we cannot know what he would have done with the question in a completed poem. Some scholars think the ending is essentially complete, that Virgil knew what he was doing and the abruptness is deliberate. Others think he would have added something, some final note of founding or peace or resolution that would have changed the emotional weight. We will never know. What we have is a poem that ends in blood and shadow, in grief and violence, in the very moment of the triumph that the whole story has been working toward. Rome is founded, implicitly, in the next moment that we do not see. The city rises, the empire follows, and the man who made it possible stands over the body of his enemy with a sword in his hand and grief in his heart, and the poem goes dark. The famous passages, what has lasted. The Aeneid has given the Western literary tradition an extraordinary number of passages and phrases that have taken on lives entirely independent of the poem. Some of them are worth dwelling on because they illuminate what the poem is doing at its deepest levels. Sunt lacrimae rerum. There are tears for the things of this world. Aeneas says this looking at paintings of the Trojan War on the walls of Carthage, moved by the recognition that even strangers weep for what Troy lost. The phrase has been applied to almost every context of human loss, and it works in almost every context because it is making a claim about the nature of reality itself. Sorrow is not incidental to the world, but inherent in it, woven into the fact of things. present wherever mortal creatures exist and care about what happens to them. Facilis descensus Averno. Easy is the descent to Avernus. The Sibyl says this to Aeneas when he asks to descend to the underworld. The descent is easy, she says. The door to the darkness stands open night and day. But to retrace the path and come back to the air above, that is the labor, that is the task. The phrase has entered the general vocabulary of English and other languages as a shorthand for the asymmetry between falling and recovering, between destruction and construction, between the easy road to ruin and the difficult road back. Tu ne sed males, said contra audentia ito. Do not yield to adversity, but go more boldly against it. This is another line from the Sibyl's advice to Aeneas, and it is as close as the Aeneid comes to a simple motto for its hero's way of being in the world. Not stoic acceptance of suffering, but active resistance to it, going forward into the difficulty rather than around it. Dum conderet urbum, until he could found the city. The phrase appears in the opening summary of Aeneas's purpose, and it recurs as a kind of refrain. Everything he does, everything he endures, is oriented toward the founding. The city is always future, always not yet, always the goal that justifies the suffering. And then the poem ends before the city is built, and we understand, perhaps, that the city is always future, always not yet, that the founding is not a moment that arrives, but a horizon that moves as you approach it. The vision of Rome in Book 6, Anchises' Pageant of Souls, has been one of the most quoted passages in Latin literature from antiquity onward. Roman emperors quoted it. Statesmen used it. It appears in political speeches and on monuments. It was used to justify empire and used to critique it, because the mission Anchises describes, to spare the conquered and beat down the proud, is both a noble aspiration and a description of what empires actually do. And the same words can read as either celebration or indictment depending on the context in which you encounter them. Virgil's style, the music of Latin. The Aeneid is written in dactylic hexameter, the same meter as Homer's epics, and it is one of the great achievements of Latin prosody, the management of the Latin language within the constraints of a Greek meter to produce verse that is at once formally strict and emotionally flexible. Virgil could make the hexameter sound like waves breaking on a shore, or like armor clashing in battle, or like a man walking slowly under a heavy burden, just by manipulating the placement of long and short syllables and the position of the central caesura, the pause that falls near the middle of each line. The famous Virgilian style is often described as golden, a vocabulary of elevated dignity, a syntax of great deliberateness, a management of sound that is one of the most controlled in any literature. He is also one of the most elusive of poets. Almost every line of the Aeneid is in conversation with other texts, primarily Homer, but also Aeneas, the early Roman epic poet, and Apollonius of Rhodes, and Lucretius and Catullus. The elusiveness is not decoration. It is a way of positioning the poem in the tradition, of asking the reader to hear the echoes and to understand what they mean, what Virgil is keeping from his predecessors and what he is changing. He uses similes in the Homeric manner, extended comparisons that pause the narrative to draw an analogy from the natural world or from ordinary life, and these similes often work against the dominant emotional current of the scene they are embedded in, creating a counterpoint of beauty or calm in moments of violence, or of violence in moments that would otherwise seem peaceful. When the Trojan warriors pour out of their ships, he compares them to ants, a colony of black ants looting a great heap of grain, carrying their booty through the grass in a long line. The comparison makes the warriors both impressive and small, both busy and blind to the larger forces moving them. The half-lines, The passages Virgil left incomplete are scattered through the poem like absences. They are usually marked in translations, and they have a peculiar effect. They remind us that we are reading a poem in process, that the maker's hand was on it until the end, and that the end came before the maker was satisfied. Some readers find them painful. Others find them oddly moving, as though the poem's incompleteness were part of its honesty, a built-in acknowledgement that some things resist completion. What the Aeneid is really about. The Aeneid has been read as a celebration of Rome and Augustus, a poem that justifies the empire by showing the divine plan working through centuries of suffering toward the golden age of the Principate. This reading has a substantial basis in the text. The vision of Rome in Book 6, the shield of Aeneas in Book 8, which depicts Roman history up to Augustus's victory at Actium, the repeated divine promises that Rome will be eternal. All of these can be read as official endorsement of the Augustan program. It has also been read as an anti-imperial poem, or at least a poem of deep ambivalence about empire, that uses the celebration as a vehicle for a private grief at what empire costs. The scholar Adam Parry called this the two voices of Virgil, the official voice that celebrates Roman destiny and the personal voice that mourns everything that destiny destroys. On this reading, Dido's death, Pallas's death, Turnus's death, the silence of the women, the tears for the things of the world, all of these are the poem's acknowledgement that the greatness being built is built on grave, that the eternal city rests on the bodies of everyone who stood in its way. Both readings are in the text, and neither cancels the other. This is part of what makes the Aeneid a great poem rather than merely a great piece of propaganda. It is large enough to contain both the celebration and the grief, to be both official and personal simultaneously, to say yes to the empire and to count every cost of that yes without flinching. Virgil was writing for Augustus, and he was also writing for himself, and for everyone who had survived the civil wars, who had seen what Rome cost, and who wondered, in the quiet of their own private thoughts, whether it was worth it. The poem does not answer this question. It sits in the question, holds it open, gives you Anchises' vision of Roman glory, and then gives you Dido's silence in the underworld, and asks you to hold both at once. This is harder than either a pure celebration or a pure critique, and it is what the poem actually does, and it is why the poem has lasted 2,000 years while most official celebration has not. The afterlife, 2,000 years of the Aeneid. The Aeneid was recognized immediately upon publication as the central poem of Latin literature, the work that established Latin's claim to be the peer of Greek as a literary language, and it never lost this status throughout antiquity. It was memorized by schoolboys, quoted by emperors, commented upon by scholars, and used as a method of divination, the sortes Virgilianae, in which you open the Aeneid at random and read the first line your eye fell on as an answer to the question you were asking. Christian Middle Ages adopted Virgil in a different mode. Dante chose Virgil as his guide through hell and purgatory in the Divine Comedy, making the greatest Latin poet the guide and companion for the greatest vernacular poem of the medieval period. Dante's Virgil is a figure of immense authority and poignant limitation. He can take Dante as far as reason and virtue can go, but he cannot enter paradise because he was born before Christ and is therefore excluded from Christian salvation. The Virgil of the Middle Ages was also read as a prophet. The fourth eclogue, in which he describes the birth of a child who will inaugurate a new golden age, was interpreted as a prophecy of the birth of Christ. This reading is almost certainly wrong as historical Virgil scholarship goes, but it gave him a kind of semi-sanctified status in medieval Christian culture that protected his work through the centuries when much classical literature was in danger. The Renaissance recovered Virgil in his own terms and made him the model for vernacular epic. Ariosto's Orlando Furioso and Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered are both deeply in conversation with the Aeneid. The Renaissance imitation of Virgil was partly formal, adopting the epic conventions, and partly thematic, engaging with the questions about empire and heroism and loss that the Aeneid raised. The most direct Renaissance engagement with Virgil in English is Spenser's The Faerie Queen, which opens with a deliberate echo of the Aeneid and uses its epic machinery throughout. John Milton studied Virgil with the seriousness of a man who intended to write the English epic, and Paradise Lost is deeply influenced by the Aeneid in its style, its structure, and in some of its most important choices. Satan in Paradise Lost has frequently been compared to Dido. The grandeur of the character, the emotional power of their suffering, the way they steal the poem from the official hero, and become the figure the reader cannot stop thinking about. Milton clearly knew what Virgil had done with Dido and was doing something analogous with Satan. In the 19th century, Virgil's reputation went through a complicated period. The Romantics preferred Homer's rawness and directness to Virgil's artifice and mediation, and for a time Virgil seemed too polished, too official, too much the voice of empire for an era that prized authenticity and rebellion. But the 20th century recovered him, partly because the 20th century had its own experiences of empire and total war that made the Aeneid's particular combination of grandeur and grief newly legible. After the First and Second World Wars, after the empires of Europe had burned down around their inhabitants, a poem about the costs of civilization and the tears inherent in the things of this world seemed less official and more honest than it had to the Romantics. Seamus Heaney translated the 6th book of the Aeneid, Aeneas's descent to the underworld in the last years of his life, and the translation, published after his death, is one of the great English Virgils, a version that hears in Virgil's Latin the same attention to loss and landscape and the weight of history that characterized Heaney's own poetry. Derek Walcott's Homeros is partly in conversation with the Aeneid as well as Homer, asking what the foundation myth of empire looks like from the perspective of the people the empire colonized. Ursula K. Le Guin translated the Aeneid in the last decade of her life, a prose translation that brings the poem's human intimacy forward over its official grandeur. Dido's afterlife, the most vivid character. Of all the characters in the Aeneid, it is Dido who has had the most independent life in subsequent literature and art, and this fact is itself a statement about what the poem does and what it means. Dido is the most fully realized person in the poem. We see her at her best, presiding over Carthage with intelligence and generosity. We see her fall into love, not of her own choice, but under divine compulsion. We see her attempt and fail to detain Aeneas. We see her grief, which the poem renders with extraordinary psychological accuracy. The way she vacillates between rage and pleading, the way she constructs reasons to go on and then dismantles them, the way she sees the betrayal coming and cannot prevent it, the way she organizes her own death with the same administrative competence she brought to building her city. We see her in the underworld, turned away. In Ovid's Heroids, written a generation after Virgil, Dido gets a letter. She writes to Aeneas, and the letter is devastating. It gives her an eloquence and a clarity that the Aeneid's narrative mode could not give her, and it makes the case against Aeneas with more directness than any passage in the Aeneid itself. Ovid's Dido says, "I'm not the kind of person who deserve to be treated like this." She says it with force. She is right. Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas, written in the 1680s, gives Dido one of the most beautiful laments in the operatic repertoire, the aria When I Am Laid in Earth, which is called Dido's Lament. The bass line descends repeatedly, slowly, the same pattern again and again, as she sings that when she is dead, her wrongs should not be remembered, only that she loved. The aria is among the most moving things in 17th century music. It is also a kind of correction. Dido in Purcell gets to say that she loved, and that the love was real, and that she should be remembered for having loved, not for having been abandoned. Christopher Marlowe's play Dido, Queen of Carthage, Shakespeare's passing reference to her in The Merchant of Venice and elsewhere, Henry Purcell's opera, Berlioz's opera Les Troyens, which covers the entire plot of the first 4 books of the Aeneid with Dido at its center. The cultural life of Dido is rich and continuous and still ongoing. She has outlasted the official purposes she was originally constructed to serve. Virgil gave her too much reality to keep in the place the story required her to occupy, and 2,000 years of readers and composers and painters have recognized this and returned to her again and again. What remains? The poem and the night. The Aeneid is a poem about what it means to carry something forward when the place you started from no longer exists. Troy is gone. The home Aeneas knew is ash and memory. Everything he carries, his father, his son, his household gods, his people, his stories, everything is a form of salvage from a catastrophe, an attempt to bring through the fire whatever can be brought through. This is a situation that has recurred throughout human history, the experience of people who survive a destruction and carry what they can into an uncertain future, who are building toward something they will not live to see, who are the link in a chain between a past that is gone and a future that does not yet exist. Aeneas's situation is mythological in its scale and specific in its detail, and both the scale and the specificity have allowed generations of readers to see their own situations in it. The poem is also about the gap between what we build and what we grieve, the knowledge that the city we construct is built on the grave of the people and places we destroyed or left behind to build it. Every civilization has this structure. Every foundation is also a loss. The Aeneid is honest enough to name both sides of this equation without resolving them into each other, without saying the building justifies the loss or the loss negates the building. It holds them in tension, in the way that the best literature holds things in tension, because the tension is the truth. Virgil died asking for the poem to be burned. He thought it was unfinished, and he was right in the sense that the final revision was never made. He was also wrong in the way that artists are sometimes wrong about their own work. The poem as it stands is one of the great achievements of human literary art, unfinished and complete simultaneously, bearing the marks of the labor that went into it and the incompleteness of everything that human beings make. The half-lines are there. The questions are unanswered. Dido does not look at him. Turnus's soul flees into the shadows. And the city, the eternal city, the justification for everything, rises in the pages we do not see, in the centuries beyond the poem's ending, in the world that Aeneas's suffering made possible and did not live to inhabit. Sunt lacrimae rerum. There are tears for the things of this world, even here in Carthage in the poem In the Night. Even here reading, the tears are there for all of it, for Troy that burned, for Dido who loved and was left, for Pallas who was young, for Turnus who was brave and wrong, for Aeneas who endured, for Anchises who died in Sicily before he reached the shore he had been promised, for Creusa who followed behind and was lost in the fire. The poem holds all of it. That is what it is for. Sleep well. Thank you for sailing with me tonight.